horrified at the notion of becoming Lutheranism. I mean, isn't the named isms? They're the heresies, right? So essentially, by calling it Lutheranism, you're proclaiming it to be a heresy. I don't think his intention was ever to separate from the Catholic Church. I think he just wanted to institute a discussion about reforms.
Right.
And that didn't go anywhere.
But then things took off.
Yes.
And
it got and all the rest of them.
Yeah, and it spiraled out of control. So that what you ended up with in Lutheranism is something rather different than the apostolic faith. And a lot of it was Luther's own personal opinions. And so it did bear his personal mark.
Yeah, but it happened because the church was not in good shape, right? When you started.
Partly. But on one hand, the institution of the church is one thing, and the faith of the church is another thing.
Yeah, it's difficult to kind of.
So
what you see is the institution usually.
Yeah. But with the Lutherans, people forget that there was a centuries-long dispute between the Germans and the papacy, and it was called the conciliarist controversy, and the Transalpine, in other words, German churches and principalities that were there. There was, the so-called Holy Roman Empire, which wasn't holy, it wasn't Roman, and it wasn't an empire. But the German principalities had been fighting since the 13th century about the nature of papal authority and its relationship to the council, ecumenical councils. And the Germans were for the most part, found themselves on the same side as the Greeks, who asserted that the authority of the church belongs in the council and not in any particular bishop, where it was the Romans who were asserting that the Pope bore authority greater than that of a council. Now the Eastern churches, not just the Greeks, but all the Eastern churches, in other words, at that time, 3/4 of Christendom, 4/5 of Christendom, rejected that, and basically said to the Romans, "You've never had that before. You're not going to have it now. Forget it." And so the Romans kind of, to put it, to oversimplify, kind of took their toys and went home. Whereas the other 4/5 of the church, which was the church from everywhere from the line between Serbia and Croatia, that's the ancient dividing line between the Roman Patriarchate and the Eastern Church, Eastern churches, is that line that was drawn through Dacia at the time. And so to the east of that line, the entire church basically embraced a conciliar understanding of ecclesiology. The Germans, north of the Alps, also embraced a conciliar understanding of ecclesiology. The English also. William the Conqueror had been sent to bring the English back in line, and the way he did it, back to Roman Orthodoxy, because the English disagreed with the papacy on how the papacy had treated the Byzantines by excommunicating the Byzantine patriarch in 1054, and the English church said, no, he was right, and you're wrong. Well, William the Conqueror went in and he butchered the entire English episcopate and installed French. And the English language is never recovered. So, that's what, there's different ways of looking at history.
It was over dispute. Really, that was a big motivating factor.
That was one of the major motivating factors for the conquest of England by the Normans.
Well, those textbooks in Massachusetts I had in the 1970s never mentioned that.
Yeah, I know. Well,
And they never will.
yeah, they never will.
They never will.
But it's really interesting is, we have a tendency to think in terms of, okay, who is the main leader? Well, Constantinople was an important patriarchate, but he didn't speak for the entire Orthodox Church. He's one patriarch among others, one bishop among others. And so, we have this idea that when the Pope excommunicated the Patriarch of Constantinople, that was the schism. Well, that's the Latin idea of the schism, 1054, because it was basically a dispute between two patriarchs, between the Roman Patriarch and the Constantinopolitan Patriarch. And it was also a rebellion because the Roman Patriarch and the Roman Church and the Roman, all that in Rome, was essentially a vassal state of the Byzantine Empire. So which is important.
There was a Roman patriarch.
Yeah, the
Not
Pope.
the Pope. Oh, the Pope. Okay.
Yeah.
I was kind of confused.
So
we don't call them the same. They're not the same, right?
he had up until 10 or 15 years ago, the Pope. One of his titles was Patriarch of the West.
Oh yeah.
I think it was Benedict who covered it.
One of them, too, more recently.
Yeah, just a few years, not too long ago. Anyway, so the schism didn't really happen on a universal level until later with when the Latins set up a parallel jurisdiction after the Crusaders destroyed Constantinople, and then with the rejection of the Council of Lyon in 1272. The Eastern Church, that would really be formally when the Eastern Church and the Western Church went into schism from one another.
Whose council was it? Who initiated
it? It was a reconciliation council.
Oh.
That failed.
Oh, in Florence, the Council of Florence.
No, that was Lyon.
Of Lyon.
In 1272, and then Florence was in 1438. But by that time, the Turks had invaded, and Rome was looking for, and Constantinople was looking for military help. They wanted a crusade, and so in the middle there was a council in Basel in 1430. Florence was in 1438. The council in Basel failed, and it was one of the conciliarist controversy councils. Well, the Greeks allied with the Romans instead of with the Germans in Florence, hoping to get a crusade to come save them from the Turks. And of course, it all failed.
Do you mean the Greek and the Roman churches might have actually been in communion then?
Oh, well, technically, essentially they were. They were, in many places they were still in full communion. But there wasn't any concelebration.
But someone who was Greek could go in a Roman church and have his confession heard, or vice versa. Or
it happened all over the place.
that's not well talked about.
Yeah, after the Fourth Crusade, most of the Greek islands were little crusader principalities. That's why you have crusader castles all over the Eastern Mediterranean. from the actual Crusades in the Holy Land and in Lebanon and in Palestine and so forth, but also Cyprus, Malta, and so there was close ongoing contact. The rulers were the Latins, and the subjected people were the Greeks were subjected people, and then the Muslims came in and they kicked out the Latins, and the Greeks still remained subjected. We saw all sorts of that when we were in Cyprus.
Mm-hmm.
Anyway.
So the schism
Did I
wasn't.
lose you?
No, not at all.
Yeah.
It wasn't universal then. I mean, it was not one official
No.
thing that covered all of Christendom, and like it is today. That
Yeah, well, basically the Patriarch of Antioch wasn't in schism with Rome until the 18th century. And that's when the Antiochians some of the Antiochians made a deal with Rome to have an Arab patriarch. They're called the Melkites.
yes, and they say officially that they are not in schism with Antioch or Rome. That they're in communion. That they refuse
They have a beautiful service, by the way.
Yeah.
It's like Orthodox, but they sing in Arabic.
Yeah.
I've seen them in Paris. They have a nice church.
Well, actually, there's a beautiful Melkite church here in McLean.
McLean,
Yeah. Holy Transfiguration.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, if you want to see good Antiochian style liturgics, that's where you go.
Okay. But the pastor, Father Francavilla, grew up in the Latin Rite in New York City, and but he once went as a young man, I think a teenager, he said, to a Byzantine rite, and he was just captivated.
Yeah. Well, it's pretty amazing. Pretty amazing. But you got to know the history.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
It really helps. I mean, it really helps to understand, or at least get a grasp of why it's the mess that it is. And on a human level, it's a mess. But on a spiritual level, I mean, there certainly with the Protestants, because every pastor's his own pope. Actually, every Protestant is kind of his own pope. Well, it is.
Yeah, but we are priests. Remember you said that.
But there's a difference. But there's no unity of mind in the Catholic Church.
No, especially today.
And there's no common vision of theology. And they try, but it's a power thing. It's a top-down power thing to try and and keep people, to try and bring people into line, and it doesn't work. We're in the Orthodox Church. There's no power, connected with the hierarchy. It's not a power structure, Chris. And so what holds Orthodoxy together is a unity of mind, and it's something I find absolutely extraordinary, absolutely mind-blowing. You can read the Fathers from the first century on, and I have. Every century, generation to generation to generation to generation, for the past 2,000 years, and you see the same experience and vision of the faith. Now, it may be a little more developed or a little less developed, or there may be certain things that are more developed, but there's no one individual in the entire history of the Orthodox Church that that you can attach their name to it. It's not the Basilian Church or the Augustinian Church or the Lutheran Church. It's or the Palomite Church or something like that. It's this unity of vision, and it's this kind of process of synthesis over the course of centuries, so that the tradition is the common vision shared by hundreds and hundreds of millions of people in hundreds of cultures, in hundreds of languages. It's a mind-blowing thing.
Yeah.
And so far as I can see, it doesn't exist anywhere else in Christianity.
Don't you think it's more tradition than knowledge?
Well, it is the tradition, because ultimately that vision, that dogmatic vision, which is really the perception of that Jesus Christ is the Son of God, and that that He's united us to Himself by His Spirit and made us participants in His kingdom. And to summarize it, it's the tradition. It's because it is that particular experience and vision that has been handed over to us by the gift of the Holy Spirit. The real core of the tradition is that there's nothing. This is a really important thing. One of the things that you find in Protestantism, you find it in Roman Catholicism, is that there's an external authority, like the Bible, like the canons. It's an external authority that you can. Orthodoxy. No, we have the Bible, we have the canons, we have the tradition.
There is a lot of obscurantism?
What's that?
Obscurantism?
No, it's not obscurantism. But there's no external authority. There's no external authority.
What did Metropolitan Jonah? He's in charge.
He's in charge, but he's not some kind of pope. He's not some kind of infallible pope. We have no external criterion of authority that's absolute.
So if you have a metropolitan or even a patriarch who became heretical for whatever reason, he wouldn't be irremovable or doesn't have universal authority over all.
There's no bishop has universal authority. Each bishop's authority is completely limited to the particular churches in a particular geographical jurisdiction, and that's the limit of his authority. And he has no authority outside of that. I mean, obviously he's still a bishop, and the church has ways of coming together in council and all of these kinds of things, which foster a greater and greater unity. Would you guys rather talk about this than?
Already talked about it.
No, we're already knee deep in it. So.
Yeah, we're pretty deep in it. But would this be useful?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
If you can add to it some of the words that I'm still trying to wrap my arms around, and it's things like the episcopate and
sure
those.
Yeah.
I got introduced to them in the early classes that I took, but
Okay.
I've lost the structure of all of that.
Okay. Yeah. Does it make sense when I say that there's no external authority?
Yes.
There's no infallible Bible. There's no infallible Pope. There's no infallible individual. In fact, actually, there's no infallible council, even, because the councils revised. We're all revised by the succeeding council. Even the Nicene Creed isn't the creed of the Council of Nicaea. It's the creed of Nicaea as revised by Constantinople.
Interesting.
But who has the ultimate say when teaching on matters of faith and morals or essential matters of?
The bishops. one of the reasons that councils are so important is that it's a matter of accountability. The bishops are given the responsibility to be fully accountable for the integrity of their teaching and the integrity of the tradition that they're handing over. So if you have a bishop who's teaching something heretical, and that can be a doctrinally heretical, it can be morally heretical, it can be, it can be a distortion of the structure of the church that's been handed down. The other bishops can remove it.
Without the external authority, where does the unity of vision come from?
The Holy Spirit.
The bishop is supposed to be elected, right, by the parish.
That's the ancient. The most important thing about the bishop is that the bishops were given authority, became the successors of the apostles. The apostles chose the bishops and ordained the bishops. In other words, they conveyed the grace of the Holy Spirit, the charism of the priesthood, the charism of the fullness of apostolic
in order to become
authority to the bishops, and the bishops convey it through the laying on of hands. It's traditio, which means the laying on of hands, or what is handed over. So the laying on of hands is what is handed over. Hierotonia in Greek, the putting on of hands. It's the charism that's handed down. Now, the tradition has concrete forms. It has concrete expressions, the scriptures, the liturgy, the structure, the teaching, the interpretation of the scriptures, and how do we understand this? Because without the tradition, it's totally without context.
I still have this question: how do you become a bishop?
Well, how do you become? There's that. Okay, I'll go into. Okay, I'm not. Let me get to that eventually. Okay. But the bishops are not an authority over the church; they're an authority within the church. And the authority is accountability. It's responsibility. And it's responsibility for the integrity of the teaching, that it's handed over in its fullness and in its integrity in all aspects. So, for example, if you have a bishop and he decides that he's teaching all this, doctrinally everything is right, but he decides to do a gay marriage, the other bishops will defrock him and cast him out, because no bishop can make such a change, and such a change I would submit is something that not even an ecumenical council could make, because it's contrary to the scriptures and the tradition and to the apostolic tradition.
So their authority is in service of the faith. The faith comes first.
The faith comes first. Father Alexander Schremen put it, the Church, Orthodox Church, is not an institution with sacraments. It's a sacrament with institutions. And there's a huge difference.
Do you say that one more time?
The Orthodox Church is not an institution with sacraments, but rather it's a sacrament with institutions. The fundamental nature of the Church is sacramental. It's fundamentally constituted by the grace of the Holy Spirit. And everything in it is fundamentally constituted by the grace of the Holy Spirit. Salvation itself, the doctrine, the structure, the priesthood, not to mention the services, the sacraments. It's all from the Holy Spirit. So historically, that's taken very specific forms. The apostles, the ministry of the apostles in the first century is that they were itinerant preachers. In the Didache, which is one of the earliest documents that we have, it predates large parts of the New Testament, in fact. It said if an apostle stays in one place for more than 3 days, you know that he's a fraud. So,
Wow.
yeah. But the apostles went around and they planted the seeds of the churches. In other words, they preached, they teach, they preached, they taught, they baptized, and they developed disciples who could shepherd the church in those particular areas, in those particular cities. And so those men eventually were ordained as bishops, presbyters, deacons, but especially at first as bishops and deacons. Presbyter came a little bit later, and there was a kind of lack of clarity between the difference between a presbyter and a bishop. But the presbyters were the board of elders of the church. It was like the parish council, whereas the bishop was the presiding pastor. And by the end of the first century, it was very clear the structure that we have now, the threefold ministry of bishop, priest, and deacon, was pretty much in place as we have it, and probably earlier. Like Paul wrote in the 60s. It's undoubtedly that was, and he talks about it, but still, it's still formative. And the bishops organized themselves, because there was obviously communication between the various churches. We read about it in the New Testament, even in the first century. And so the bishops organized themselves into councils, into regional councils. And the one who would preside was the bishop of the largest city or the most important city in the area. In other words, the local county seat or the regional capital or the whatever, until you got, this whole network of councils. And then small councils were then pulled, which would meet on a twice-a-year basis, were pulled into larger councils, which would meet less frequently. And so the bishop of that city, of the largest city in the entire region, became known as a metropolitan. Or archbishop means high bishop. and by the 3rd century, you had 3 major metropolitan sees. You had Rome, you had Antioch, and you had Alexandria. Jerusalem was still Aelia Capitolina, which was the pagan city that the Romans built on the ruins of Old Jerusalem. And there were Christians there, but it wasn't a major Christian center. Constantinople wasn't even thought of yet. But those were the 3 major cities of the Roman Empire. And they controlled all the trade, the commerce, the economics, and the politics, or the political life of Alexandria controlled Africa, Antioch controlled the East, and Rome controlled Europe. Then there were other metropolitan centers within those, and so those major centers came to be known as patriarchs, because they would have multiple metropolitans under them, each of which would have multiple bishops under him. And it's, when I say under, it's not like top-down authority, because all bishops are equal. Patriarch is and a diocesan bishop it's the same episcopacy. There's no such thing as a super bishop. But the patriarch or a metropolitan has supervisory authority over the bishops in his synod. And the whole structure was created to preserve the unity and the integrity of the church, and the unity and integrity of the faith. And so it wasn't when Constantine finally called the First Ecumenical Council in 325, there had been councils since the 1st century of bishops. You can read about the first major council in Acts 15. But it was the first council of the ecumeny, in other words, of the whole empire, because it was the first time that you could have such a thing, because there had been persecutions, and it had been a pagan empire, and so you couldn't have gotten all the bishops into one place before. Whereas Constantine, by declaring Christianity to be legal, and financing all the transportation, was able to organize this huge meeting of 318 bishops in the year 325 to address a specific issue, the issue of Arianism, and also to organize the structure of the church. Now, this is still 60 years before Christianity became the official religion of the Roman Empire. So it's not like, the Protestants have, and the sectarian, like Adventists and stuff, have all these crazy fantasies about Constantine, and Constantine he's an Orthodox saint. I mean, there's no question about that. He delayed baptism till his deathbed because he didn't think a Roman emperor could be a Christian, because he had to do so many things that hurt so many people.
Oh.
But it's pretty interesting that he could call a council already in 325, and that was the first of 7 or 8 ecumenical councils. It's not officially recognized as the 8th because there hasn't been a 9th. And you have to have a succeeding council to call the previous one ecumenical.
Interesting.
So, yeah. So the system of councils is very important, and it has been ever since the beginning of the life of the church. And so, so jumping ahead, 700 or 800 years, the development of the papacy asserting all sorts of universal authority and all of that. Everybody looked, aside from the fact that the Byzantines looked down at the West as basically a bunch of illiterate barbarians, who couldn't even speak Greek. Seriously, that's how they regarded the Latins, a bunch of illiterate barbarians, and most of them were in reality, and pretenders to the. They viewed Charlemagne as a pretender to the throne, and a rather pathetic one at that. So things look a lot different from the non-Western side of non-Western perspective on history. You look at it from the Eastern perspective, because here's this great imperial capital, thriving city-state and thriving empire, even if it was kind of besieged on one side by Islam, looking over at Rome, say in the year 1000 or 1100, where there were 5,000 people living among the ruins. Whereas Constantinople had 1 million people.
Were some of the issues, my nephew's done some study, but he's not an expert, but he's sort of an historian, that a lot of the greater and greater assertions of papal authority within Christendom find their origin in the struggles that the bishops of Rome were having with the secular political rulers and people, and so they were trying to, who wanted to assert their authority over the church. So the popes in Rome would say, no, they would fight back, and one way to do that was to win in the spiritual or ecclesiastical realm, and so it had this kind of spillover effect that it was sort of this path toward this concept of universal ordinary jurisdiction, the supreme legislator of the church. But
that doesn't come up until the Middle Ages, really. And Rome finally fell in 476. But the West was already in social, political, economic chaos because of the so-called barbarian invasions. Our people, Justinian took back parts of Italy, Gaul, the Iberian Peninsula, bits and pieces of the former Western Empire. He never restored the West, and that didn't last very long. And so it basically just plunged into the Dark Ages in the 7th, 6th, 7th, 8th century, 9th century. You had Charlemagne, the year 800. This little Frankish prince, but he claiming to be Holy Roman Emperor, and he had turned back the Muslims, from France, but the decisive factor in the politics was that the Pope, who had been a vassal of the Byzantine Emperor, because he was both the secular and the religious ruler. There were two distinct ideas of church-state relations in the two different parts of the Roman Empire. In Old Rome, You had the papacy, and by the Middle Ages, being both the secular and the religious ruler. Total unity of. Whereas in the East, you had a symphony from the time of Constantine, who may have started out in the West, but he, really most of his life ended up with the East. A symphony between the church and the state. That's why you have the double-headed eagle as the symbol of the Byzantine Empire. And so when Charlemagne rose up as a secular as a strong ruler, the first strong ruler in the year 800, the Pope switched his allegiance from Constantinople to Charlemagne, from the Roman Emperor in Constantinople to the fake Roman Emperor in France, and which didn't go over very well with the Byzantines. They were amused, basically, in as condescending a way as one could imagine. That was kind of the point of the real break between East and West. Because up until that time, Constantinople had to pay attention to the West because it was its vassal. After that time, the Romans were more focused on France, and Constantinople became more focused on Islam, the battle against Islam. Now, there was still another 300, 400 years of Dark Ages left. So 1096 was when the First Crusade was called, and it was called by the Pope, and the reason for that was because it was an attempt to assert an authority greater than any secular ruler in the West, because they were all just little princedoms. There are all these little castles everywhere, and they're little, petty little despots, and so it was an attempt by the papacy to unify the West, and as a secular, I can't say secular, as a political ruler, religious political ruler, by raising an army, which is the task of a king, to raise an army. And it was an army that was composed of armies from all of these other little princedoms. And so what it did was it was an assertion of the power of the papacy as both religious and temporal ruler, that not only had yielded religious authority, but yielded secular authority. Now, Constantinople by this time had lost half the empire to Islam, and it was this brutal butchery, no different than ISIS was doing, for centuries. And so in so the Crusades were raised to take back the Holy Land, and to free the Holy Land from Islam. That did work for a little while, but by 1204, the Byzantine emperor said, "We need help. We need military help to turn back the Islamic armies." Well, the help arrived instead they looted Constantinople instead of going after the Muslims. from which it never recovered. You know, Constantinople was a shadow of itself after that. And that marked a huge. That was 1204. And then there's all sorts of other elements in that. But the Latins established a patriarchate in Constantinople, not recognizing the Greeks. And then 1268, the Greeks got Constantinople back, but it was a ruin. The city was a ruin. And so, anyway, I forgot where I was going with that. But that's all part of the basis of what went into this, the conciliarist controversy and the rise of the papacy, and the Eastern resistance against papal imperial power. Because from the beginning of the 9th century, you had this kind of assertion of papal authority over kings. And Rome, and the Vatican, and Rome itself as a secular power. Does this make sense? Okay, now. So really, I mean, you look at the history, and the Reformation is basically just one more chapter in these controversies about the nature of authority within the church, and then there were all these philosophical developments at the time as well, and then it was but that was all going on in the West, and in the East things had changed because in 1453 Constantinople itself was overrun by the Ottomans, and not only Constantinople, but almost the entire Orthodox world, with the exception of Russia, was under Islamic rule. So the empire was destroyed. You had the Ottomans instead, but Constantinople was turned into what they called the millet, and the Patriarch of Constantinople had responsibility for all of the Christians within the Ottoman Empire, which also contributes to the growth of the perceived authority of the Patriarch of Constantinople, because the Ottomans he had that kind of administrative authority within the Ottoman Empire. Each of the religions had their millet, and Christianity was Constantinople. And the Ottoman Empire stretched from, Morocco and Spain all the way to India, basically.
Why was there no Reformation? All these philosophical movements in the West, they didn't seem to take root in the East.
No, they didn't. Partly because a lot of the scholasticism had taken root in the West, starting in the 11th century, 12th century. Through the Arabs, I can't remember the name. Aristotle was introduced to in the West, but Aristotle and his philosophy was introduced without commentary. It was just the text itself, just his text. Now, in the Greek-speaking East, every schoolboy, there probably weren't too many schoolgirls, but every schoolboy would learn. There were some, but every schoolboy would learn Aristotle. But it would always be taught in a Christian context. we don't accept this, we don't accept this, this is pagan, you know. This is interesting, but, you know, but you can forget about this. The same thing with Plato, same thing with the rest of Greek philosophy. Whereas the texts got transmitted to the West without that context. And so scholasticism developed using the principles of Aristotle and Aristotelian logic as applied to theology. Now, you had integral Orthodox theology within the Benedictine monasteries, the various Benedictine traditions, but theology as a scholastic discipline, as a university discipline, developed not in the monasteries, but in the universities, and not among the monks, in other words, the Benedictines, but among the friars, like Dominicans. And so there was this bifurcation in the Western Church between the classical Orthodox theology of the Fathers in the monasteries and the theological, philosophical speculations in the universities. And so there were all these controversies and, you know, nominalism and so on and so forth. And Protestantism, in reality, you look at Luther, Luther was just one more school of scholastic thought when it comes down to it. And
the problem with scholasticism is that it allows for speculation, among other issues.
Well, it's divorced from its spiritual foundation. It's purely it's a rationalist production.
And taught and approached as such
yes.
by clergy.
By clergy. Yeah, I mean they were all clergy. Most of them were clergy anyway, you know. But it's the difference between the lived theology of a monastery and the artificial, in a sense, theology of a university. There's a big difference. In other words, scholasticism was the beginning of secularization. Or of secularism. It wasn't atheist secularism, but it was definitely a kind of movement towards.
They placed the primacy on reason.
Yeah. And so, and primacy on reason, and then you had the texts of the scriptures and of the fathers became external authorities that you could create rational arguments from, which is what Aquinas is, you know, so much of his thought, or so much of his writings.
Then that leads to error?
It did. It led to all sorts of error. Because because the presuppositions were founded in Aristotelian logic and Neoplatonism instead of in the patristic philosophy as developed by the fathers. The patristic tradition continued for a long time in the West, and then it began to be suppressed. And then the first suppression was of the mystics, because they feared that they were heretics, because they weren't towing the line to the Dominicans, who were the university, you know, theology professors, and then people like St. John of the Cross and Teresa of Avila were They spent years in prison. And so, and that created all sorts of problems, and so. But if you look at the development of Protestantism, it's very much a rationalist. Luther's system is a rationalist, scholastic system based on Aristotelian logic, using scriptures primarily as its source. Sola Scriptura. That's where it comes from. And but even Luther was trying to get back to some of the presuppositions from the fathers, except he didn't know where to go. He couldn't get there because it was so mixed up. But he was a friar, not a monk. There's a big difference. And then Calvin the same thing, except Calvin wasn't a friar. Calvin was a lawyer. And actually, much of Western theology is because of lawyers. Ambrose was a lawyer. Augustine was a lawyer.
I knew lawyers were bad.
I think Tertullian might have been a lawyer. I don't remember. Tertullian was the real father of Latin theology. It was the first kind of major problem. Anyway. So what is Protestantism? Is it's a rationalist reconstruction of Christianity based on certain principles. Number one, mainly that the scriptures are the sole source for theological reasoning. Except part of the problem is there are contradictions within the scriptures. So one of the things that Luther wanted to do is he wanted to get rid of certain books of the New Testament because they contradicted his ideas. You know?
Tolstoy on this too.
Yeah, Tolstoy too.
Tolstoy too. He wrote his own gospel.
So did Thomas Jefferson.
Oh, yeah.
Well,
No, he wasn't reforming the church. So.
yeah.
No, he was trying to get to the core of Jesus' teachings.
Yeah. But
Cutting stuff out.
Yes.
yeah, and so they threw the baby out with the bathwater.
Yeah.
And so did the Protestants. So, and the West and the Latin Church was a mess, too. And it was socially, politically, and economically a mess, as well as theologically a mess. All through the, from the beginning of scholasticism, there were all these controversies, and then they developed the Inquisition. Then and then the Reformation began, and then there was the Counter-Reformation, and then and before, at the same time as the Inquisition, was the conciliarist controversies. So, and part of the Inquisition was as much of an assertion of civil authority as of religious. So in the West, I mean, things were really kind of out of hand, and part of it is that there was no overarching civil authority, and the Pope and the papacy couldn't handle it. This is like a really quick overview of European history. Yeah. So.
When did the I'm fascinated by that quotation of Father Alexander Schneemann on the institution of sacraments versus the sacrament of institutions.
Yeah.
That's fascinating. I mean, East and West started out originally in the early days of the church as the Christian church, as the Christian way of life. So what happened with the Catholic Church? Was it just gradually it became an institution with sacraments instead of the other way around?
Well, I think especially in the second millennium, as it asserted civil authority, as it asserted temporal power, it became much more an institution, it became a power wielding institution, as opposed to simply religious authority and moral authority. And it certainly lost its moral authority in many ways at various times through corruption.
All of this would be a major stumbling block, I think, to the real unification of the Eastern and Western Church.
No?
No.
Well, no, I mean, it's not. It's actually, the Eastern Church has a history too, of corruption but in some ways Islam saved the Orthodox Church.
Really?
Yeah.
How so?
Well, because it prevented it from, it forced it into a kind of a very conservative mode. And so it did not enter into all of this process that was going on in the West. 1453, Islam basically, that was when Constantinople fell. But Islam went from the Danube, Greece, Romania, parts of Ukraine, Hungary, all of what's, Yugoslavia, Croatia, Serbia, Albania, Greece, the whole Balkan Peninsula was part of the Ottoman Empire, not to mention the ancient Christian homelands of Asia Minor, of Syria, of Palestine, of Egypt, North Africa, all around the Mediterranean, except for from Italy to the Pyrenees, and then most of France, or most of Spain and parts of France were under Islamic control. So it was, and so the Christian West was a kind of last island, an island of Christianity in an Islamic sea, and then you had Orthodox Russia way off to the east. Islam, there was still Northern Europe that was Christian, but the influence of Islam is not something that we can minimize. And so the church, it was a brutal time of martyrdom. The Christians were reduced to dimitude, which means that they had to. They were given when they were conquered. They were given a choice: either convert, or you die, or you pay. And most of the poor people, of course, couldn't pay, and they didn't want to die, so they converted. And the only people who could remain Christian were the wealthy, and so they paid. And that's why, for example, in Egypt, the Coptic community is the wealthy upper class. They have been since Byzantine times. They were the wealthy who were able to pay off Muslims. Same thing in Syria, in Palestine. Of course, with the Palestinians, they weren't able to pay off the Jews. but the Muslims who were able to pay off.
The Jews paid the Palestinians.
But of course, Russia also went through its 300 years much earlier than the Tatars.
Well, not much earlier.
No, not a lot.
No, the Tatars were turned back. The Tatars were turned back about the same time as the Muslims were turned back in 1492.
Yeah.
So, but there's interesting history there. Okay, ask me some questions about some of this. Going to a history lecture without a specific goal.
What do you think accounts for the large population difference today between the Catholic Church at like 1.6 billion and Eastern Orthodoxy at, I don't know, around 350 million, I think?
Mm-hmm. Well, in the first place, the traditional borders of the Western Church was Western Europe. In the traditional. Then the Americas, Asia, Africa, those were, especially, the Catholic Church is huge in South America. It's huge in North America too, and in Africa and in Asia, and so those are areas that were colonized. I don't know how many Catholics are left in Western Europe. Are there 100 million Catholics left in Western Europe? 25% of the population?
Not by faith.
Probably not.
No, I mean by faith. There's some ethnic Catholics, but it's pretty low. Whereas the great bulk of the faithful Catholics are in Africa. They're in Asia.
That's in America.
There's some, and there's a lot of secular Catholics, nominal Catholics down there too. But I mean that was it. It was history. Now, if the Russians had turned back the Spanish instead of the Spanish turning back the Russians, North America would look rather different. Because the westernmost Russian colony is 40 miles north of San Francisco. So, all of the Pacific Northwest was Russian and claimed it as part of the Russian Empire. Russia didn't have the same kind of vast imperial expanse in the same way as like Spain and Portugal. It wasn't involved in the same kind of imperial expansion as Western Europe. It had a different kind of. They simply took adjacent lands. First they pushed south, and they pushed back the Muslims, and then they pushed east. And it was basically, most of Siberia was unsettled. There were wild tribes, but it was unsettled. So there's a big difference. Is that?
Yeah. Also, you said that there was. Can you talk a little more about the influence of Islam on Orthodoxy in those years?
Which years?
Well, around the fall of the Byzantine Empire, I guess.
Well, yeah. I mean, the influence, of course, was seen as a hostile power. Very early on, St. John of Damascus, who was one of the great hymnographers and great theologians of the church, he lived he wrote in the 720s, which was shortly after Islam arose. He wrote that Islam was the kingdom of Antichrist, and that Muhammad was an antichrist, and he's probably right, of course. So there's, there was huge, there was immense conflict with the Roman Empire, the Eastern Roman Empire, the Western Roman Empire. By what? Muhammad was born in what, 638 or thereabouts, and by 675 or thereabouts, Arab armies had reached the Atlantic. And taken the entire southern Mediterranean area, and so and with millions and millions and millions of people, and so and these weren't huge armies, but they subjected the people and got them to convert, and so they were lost to Christendom, to the Roman Empire. Christendom and the Roman Empire being the same thing, and and all of Syria and Palestine as well, and so there was Islam was a kind of a constant battle. It was constant, ongoing war along the edges to keep the Muslims back. After their initial seizure of so much, of course, the empire was greatly weakened because northern Africa was the breadbasket. There were huge amounts of crops that came out of Egypt, and it was Carthage that fed Rome. All the major trade, all the wheat, the olives, especially the wheat, came out of North Africa to Rome. And one of the key elements in the fall of Rome was stopping the trade from North Africa. And that so it created starvation. And plagues didn't help either. So by the time you get to the 12th, 13th century, you've had the Crusades going since 1096. 1204 was really kind of the last hurrah, and the Fourth Crusade never got there. There were a couple of minor incursions, crusaders going to the east, but it was fairly soon after that the Crusader kingdoms in the Middle East fell, and there was a backlash against the Christians. And Constantinople wanted to maintain the Christian communities in Jerusalem and in Lebanon, and so forth. But militarily, they were unable to do so because they'd been so weakened. And there had been incursions of Islam all into the Balkan Peninsula as well. So that cut off major trade routes in Constantinople. You can't. How do you feed a city of 1 million people? It takes a lot of stuff from a lot of places. There's an amazing video on YouTube. I think that the channel is Byzantium 1200, but it is a total reconstruction of Constantinople in 1200. It's like the waterways of Constantinople is the title of one of them. Yeah. It's like 9 minutes long. It's breathtaking. It's absolutely breathtaking.
Byzantium
1200. It's a YouTube channel. and it's amazing, amazing to think about. I mean, at the time there was nothing in the West. The largest, nothing in the West over 10,000 people. Up until probably the 12th century. And then that was fed by Easterners fleeing to the West. And in fact, to a large degree, the Renaissance probably came from Byzantines fleeing to the West.
That would make sense.
Yeah. And that started in 1204. From Constantinople. It probably started earlier in the other areas that the Turks were raiding. So by the 14th century, or by the 15th century, economically, socially, politically, Constantinople was essentially occupied by Venice. The Venetians controlled, had seized most of the trade. They'd stripped down the great cathedral, Hagia Sophia. You can see most of what was the treasures of Hagia Sophia in St. Mark's in Venice. And thank God they did, because otherwise the Muslims would have taken it and melted it all down. And so there was, so the Byzantines were left desperate, essentially. Now it's interesting about that same time that one of the Khans from not the Golden Horde, but one of the Mongolian Khans, who was a Christian, because the large proportions of the Mongols were Syriac Christians, so-called Nestorians, offered a crusade with the Latins to take back Constantinople, but especially to take back Jerusalem from the Muslims. There's all these little. The West wasn't able to do it. It was too late, I mean, it's really interesting. Genghis Khan's mother was Christian.
Wow.
Yeah. So there's all sorts of things, these little tidbits of history that are quite, and that history of the church in the East, in the Far East, is really interesting. You see how this fits all together? Yeah, it's one of the weirdest things about Protestantism is it's ahistorical. The only thing that matters is me and Jesus, right?
Yes.
History really doesn't mean anything. Tradition means nothing.
It's also already something.
What's
already something?
Well, no, but it literally means nothing to them.
Well, either that or they look at it like a distant textbook, you know what I mean? It's not. I feel like orthodoxy goes through, and it's part of our spine, it's in our bones.
Yeah.
Whereas if you ask a Protestant, or if you go to really any sort of Protestant thing, it's kind of like, oh well, back when the way they did things back then, it's no. I mean, it is completely ahistorical, and if they want to get into any bit of history, it's kind of like a foreign subject.
Yeah. Well, it doesn't mean anything.
It doesn't mean anything to him. Like it only goes through.
It's just viewed as history. It doesn't have any particular significance other than just a factual. This is what happened on this particular date, and it affected this, that, and the other. But it doesn't have a spiritual context.
Whereas for us, this is our family.
Right.
This is our family in all of its various branches, And you got these weird uncles, and strange aunts, and some of them, some of them have slanty eyes, and some of them are black, and some of them are blonde, and so but it's like one community, and it's this living continuity, across peoples, across races, across languages, across cultures, Okay, so we mostly talked about the Roman Empire tonight. Okay. You could also talk about the church in the Persian Empire. You can talk about the church in the Ottoman Empire. You can talk about the church in the Russian Empire. You can talk about the church in the Ethiopian Empire. And in the Ethiopian Yemeni Empire. Which was very interesting. And one of the things that's really interesting to me is like you've all seen these pictures of these like 7-foot tall black guys in Nubia that go around naked, and those cultures were Christian. If you can believe it. Nubia was a major Christian center.
Oh, wow.
At one time. So the damage done by Islam is immense. And and the history, and a lot of the earlier history of Christianity in the Roman Empire and how Rome dealt with its heretics. In other words, they exiled them. And so they exiled them to outside the empire. So first came the Arians, and they exiled them up to the north because they were mostly in Europe. Well, who was in the north? The Germanic peoples. So what did they do? They converted them to Arianism. And so not only did you have Germanic invasions, there were also Arians who were fighting against the Catholic Church, the Orthodox Catholic Church. Then you had the Nestorians and the Monophysites. Well, where did they get exiled to? Arabia. And Arians off to Arabia. So what happens? They all come, it all comes together in Islam.
A lot of Muhammad, he learned a lot from Jewish and Christian peoples or preachers, but they had a lot of heretical ideas.
His wife was Christian.
And like the Trinity is the Father, the Son, and Mary. They think that Mary is and they have all kinds of ideas, but they were based on a lot of heretical ideas that gathered in that.
Yeah, there was all sorts of weird stuff, and part of it is because there was no system of accountability for the teaching, for the integrity of the teaching, and that's really important, and that's why. And Orthodoxy is still very, very, very careful about who it makes a bishop. It could be more careful. Could be a lot more careful. Because it's critical that we preserve the full integrity of the faith, handed on from generation to generation to generation. And that doesn't mean that the expressions don't change, because the expressions have to change because language changes, but the content has to be the same. And so, here, for example, the Russian Orthodox, right? Okay. The main thing that differentiates it from Constantinople in the 12th century is the language and the music. Otherwise, and the style. The iconographic style is a little different. The vestments are more or less the same. The ritual is the same. The texts are the same. But the language and the music sound different. What differentiates it from the 7th or 8th century? Well, the ritual wasn't quite as developed, but the vestments were more or less the same. The text was more or less the same. You know, you walk into the church, it would, you know, the system of iconography would have been a little different. But it's not a whole lot different. I mean, somebody from the 5th century could walk into this church and feel at home. And we could feel at home in a church in the 5th century, or in the 7th century, or in the 12th century, or in the 15th century, and hopefully in the 25th century. Morality, the same. The disciplines were a little bit different, you know, as to how the moral, so the penitential disciplines were different. It was unsustainable how they were doing that. But and so different parts of it arose. Did it change the teaching or the morality or the content of it? Not a bit. Just how to apply the discipline if you fell. So.
Can you give any examples?
It's
Because now in confession they don't give penance. I wait for penance. They don't tell.
it's between me and Jesus.
Well, for example, if I don't know, you commit adultery in the Byzantine, in the early church, or in the say in the 5th century or 6th century, your penance would be, you would probably have to stand outside the church on the steps for 2 years and ask forgiveness of everybody who came in. Then eventually you could spend a year or so in the narthex and ask forgiveness of everybody who came in. And then eventually you could go back into the church for a year, but you'd have to leave with the catechumens. And then you could be absolved and restored to communion. If you committed abortion, it was 10 years of excommunication.
Wow.
Mm-hmm.
So would they expect you to be around though praying?
Absolutely.
Even if you don't do it.
Yeah.
So they would withhold forgiveness or
Yep.
there were no communion, but show up and
Show up, you better be there. And do your penance.
would they assign a lot of extra prayers and
I don't think so. Not at that point, because by the 8th or 9th century, it had combined with monastic spiritual direction, and so instead of sins being made public, and obviously if you're doing a public penance, there was some kind of public confession, but the sins were confessed in private, and the penance was done in private. So things do change like that, but for example, what I refer to as the discipline is how many years somebody is excommunicated as a penance. What is the content of the penance? The penance, and that's purely, ultimately, pastoral discretion. There are some canons about it, old canons, but they're not used, because that whole system basically has been out of use for over 1,000 years. But what has not changed is what are the definition of sins. You know, it's not like adultery was a sin 2,000 years ago and it's not a sin anymore. Or game, homosexual, encounter was a sin back then, and it's not in. No, we don't go there. How it's dealt with pastorally is what changes. And then, there's another aspect too that, that's I could go off on that. But you get the idea. Was this useful?
Mm-hmm.
Very interesting.
Okay. Well, so next week we'll go back to the anaphora of the Liturgy of St. James. So, all right. Shall we?
Mm-hmm.
Does anybody else have any burning questions? Oh, you asked how do you become a bishop?
Yeah, you didn't tell
Oh.
me. I thought it was a secret.
It is.
And the definition of the
It's a secret.
episcopate.
Right? What's the
You have to-
apostolic.
Ultimately, you're elected by the other bishops.
Was it like that all the time?
In some places, the congregation would elect a bishop, or the priests would elect a bishop of a
I
diocese.
think in Russia they are nominated.
Yeah, and I think the way that we do it is that they're nominated by the diocese, but they have to be elected by the other bishops.
Hmm.
So they should know each other.
Yeah.
Okay.
So, and it varies from jurisdiction to jurisdiction, and place to place, and time to time. But but the canonical requirement is a bishop has to be elected by the other bishops of a particular synod to be a member of that synod.
Hmm.
There's no such thing as bishops at large. You have to be a bishop of a particular place.
Hmm.
So,
For no vagrant or wandering.
nope.
No wondering for the bishop.
No vagantes.
Vagrant. So you can make me a bishop, and then I can just sort of like go to places where I think,
You'll
Florida
be useful.
next month, and I'll go.
Nope. Nope, you're out of luck.
Oh, so that's why you won't be a bishop.
No, there are people that do that.
Oh, there are.
So how big is a synod? Is a synod just is it a region? Is it a...
It varies in size. A synod is a meeting of the bishop, or it's an organization, as it were, of the bishops of a particular region.
Of a region, okay.
Yeah.
So the church was always liturgical.
Always from the very beginning. The apostles coming out of coming out of the temple and out of Judaism wouldn't have known anything except liturgical worship. And this whole thing about sitting, some kind of prayer meeting or stuff. I mean, that's a Protestant invention. It was always liturgical from the beginning. And look at the Book of Revelation.
Mm-hmm.
That's a big liturgy and very formal. And you don't have priests vested in investments with golden crowns, standing around an altar throne with candles surrounded by incense, and that's a big liturgy, and that's the church's vision of the liturgy. Revelations 4 or 5. So. Okay. It is truly meet to bless thee, O Theotokos, ever blessed and most pure, and the Mother of our God, more honorable than the cherubim, more glorious beyond compared than the seraphim, and without corruption gave us birth to God the Word. True Theotokos, we magnify thee. The blessing of the Lord be upon you through his grace and love for mankind, always now and ever, into ages of ages. Amen.